The road into the mountains narrows until it feels less like a way forward and more like a warning. Trees press close, blotting out the sky, and the air grows heavy with the sense that some places were never meant to be found. In one such hollow, tucked deep in Appalachia, stood a house where time seemed to rot instead of pass, and where a family secret festered for decades without daylight. From the outside, it looked like many others scattered across the ridges, weathered wood, a sagging porch, silence broken only by wind through leaves. Inside lived a father who ruled with quiet certainty, the kind of man neighbors described as strict but God-fearing, private but dependable. He taught his children that the world beyond the hills was cruel, sinful, and dangerous. Safety, he said, existed only under his roof. His daughter grew up believing that obedience was love and fear was normal. She learned early that questions were punished and silence was rewarded. When her body began to change, there were no explanations, only commands. When she became pregnant, there were only threats and rehearsed stories. The truth was buried so deeply that even she struggled to name it. Children were born into that house who should not have existed, their lives marked by the same isolation that had trapped their mother. No school records, no doctors, no birth certificates, only the walls that watched everything and said nothing. In town, people noticed oddities. A girl who never seemed to grow up, babies that appeared without fathers. But in the mountains, minding your own business is a kind of law. It wasn't one dramatic scream that shattered the silence, but a crack, small, trembling, and long overdue. And when the truth finally surfaced, it revealed not just the horror inside one family, but the cost of a community's decision to look away, and a darkness so close to home it had blended in with the shadows of the hills. The hollow sat far beyond where roads were meant to go, a place the maps barely acknowledged and most people never searched for. Getting there required turning off the last paved road, then the last gravel one, following a dirt track that narrowed with every mile until the forest seemed to swallow it whole. Trees rose like walls, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out the sky and turning daylight into a dim, greenish gloom. In this part of Appalachia, isolation wasn't considered dangerous, it was considered wise. Distance from the world meant distance from trouble, and the farther a family lived from outsiders, the safer they believed themselves to be. Generations had grown up with the idea that the mountains were protectors, not barriers. The hills hid you from judgment, from government eyes, from questions that led nowhere good. Neighbors were miles apart, close enough to recognize one another at church but far enough to never truly know what happened behind closed doors. Privacy was sacred here, enforced not by law but by custom, and anyone who asked too many questions was treated as a threat rather than a helper. The hollow itself felt cut off from time. Radios crackled with static, phone signals died without warning, and news from the outside arrived late, if it arrived at all. Children born there learned early that the world beyond the trees was something to fear. Cities were full of wickedness, strangers were dangerous, and authority belonged to the head of the household, not to any badge or court. Isolation became a lesson passed down like scripture, repeated until it sounded like truth. In such places, control could disguise itself as care. A father could claim he was protecting his family from harm, and no one would argue. A locked gate could be called caution. A daughter kept from school could be described as sheltered. When isolation is normal, warning signs lose their shape. Silence blends into the landscape, as natural as fog settling into the valleys at dawn. The hollow didn't scream danger, it whispered reassurance. It promised safety through separation, survival through secrecy. And when something went wrong inside that house, there was no easy way out, no passing stranger to notice, no neighbor close enough to hear cries carried off by the trees, only the mountains standing still, holding everything in place, guarding not just the family within but the darkness growing quietly at its center. In the eyes of the community, he was a man beyond suspicion, someone whose word carried weight simply because it had always gone unchallenged. He worked hard, kept to himself, and showed up when it mattered most, helping mend fences, lending tools, bowing his head in prayer on Sundays. In a place where reputation was built slowly and rarely questioned, that was enough to earn trust. People described him as stern but fair, a father who ran a tight household in a world that seemed to be unraveling everywhere else. Inside the home, his authority was absolute. He decided what was said, what was believed, and what was never to be spoken aloud. His children grew up understanding that disagreement was not just disrespect, it was danger. He spoke calmly when he issued commands, rarely raised his voice, which made his control feel even more final. Rules were framed as lessons, punishments as corrections meant for their own good. Over time, fear became indistinguishable from loyalty. He understood the power of appearances. To outsiders, he played the role expected of him: protective father, disciplined provider, man of faith. He knew how to answer questions without inviting more, how to smile just enough to appear approachable while keeping his distance. Any odd behavior within the family was explained away as strict values or old-fashioned beliefs, and most people accepted that explanation without pushing further. His authority extended beyond his household because no one wanted to challenge it. In a culture where minding your own business was considered respectful, questioning a father's control over his family was seen as intrusive. Even when whispers surfaced, they were smothered by the belief that every family had its own way of doing things. The idea that a respected man could be capable of something monstrous felt more uncomfortable than the rumors themselves. For his daughter, this unquestioned authority became a cage. She was taught that he was the ultimate source of truth, that disobedience would bring consequences far worse than compliance. Love was conditional, safety fragile, and approval always just out of reach. The world she knew had one ruler, and he had carefully built it so that no one inside the home or beyond it would ever think to challenge him. From the time she could remember, she was taught that the world beyond their land was something to be feared. Strangers were dangerous, authorities were liars, and curiosity was a weakness that invited punishment. Her father's voice was the first truth she learned, repeated so often that it drowned out her own thoughts before they ever fully formed. Every warning sounded like protection, every restriction like love. By the time she was old enough to question anything, questioning itself felt like a betrayal. She rarely left the property, and when she did, it was always under watchful eyes. School was described as corrupt, filled with people who would poison her mind and steal her innocence. Friends were unnecessary, even sinful. Her world narrowed to the rooms of the house, the routines she was given, and the rules that shifted without explanation. She learned to measure her safety by his moods, to anticipate his needs before he spoke, to stay quiet even when silence hurt. Fear was woven into everyday life so tightly that it felt normal. When she was punished, she was told it was for her own good. When she cried, she was reminded that tears were weakness. When she was confused, she was accused of being ungrateful. Over time, her sense of right and wrong blurred, replaced by a single instinct: survive by obeying. She didn't have the language to describe what felt wrong, only the certainty that resisting would make things worse. As she grew older, her isolation deepened. Her body changed, but there was no guidance, no explanation, only shame and secrecy. Any questions she dared to form were shut down before they reached her lips. She was taught that what happened inside the home was private, sacred, not meant for outside ears. The idea of asking for help felt as dangerous as stepping off a cliff. She believed, as she had been taught, that no one would protect her if she spoke. That the outside world would judge her, punish her, or abandon her. Trapped between fear of her father and fear of everything beyond him, she remained silent, carrying a burden she didn't know how to name, convinced that this was simply the life she had been born into and that there was no other way it could be. The first pregnancy arrived wrapped in confusion and terror, her body betraying her in ways she didn't understand and had never been prepared for. She noticed the changes quietly, hiding them under loose clothing, hoping somehow they would disappear if left unspoken. When the truth could no longer be concealed, it was met not with concern or explanation, but with control. She was told what to say, what not to say, and most importantly, who to blame. The story was crafted quickly, rehearsed until it sounded believable even to her own ears. To anyone who might ask, there was always an answer ready. A boy from far away. A mistake that would never be repeated. A sin already forgiven. In a community that valued privacy and avoided uncomfortable questions, the explanation was accepted with uneasy nods and lowered eyes. People wanted to believe the lie because the alternative was too disturbing to consider. The pregnancy became something unfortunate but ordinary, stripped of its true horror by silence. Inside the house, the lie was enforced relentlessly. She was warned that if she spoke differently, everything would be taken from her. She would lose her home, her family, even her children. Fear kept her compliant, and shame sealed her mouth. Each time she repeated the false story, it settled deeper into her reality, until the truth felt distant, almost unreal. The lie wasn't just for outsiders anymore, it became a shield she hid behind to survive her own days. When another pregnancy followed, the explanations grew thinner but no less forceful. This time, the blame shifted again, always outward, always away from the man who controlled every aspect of her life. The children were presented as burdens she must bear quietly, reminders of her supposed wrongdoing. She was made to feel responsible, as if her own existence had caused everything that followed. The babies were never celebrated, never acknowledged openly. They existed in the margins of the household, their origins unspoken, their presence explained only when absolutely necessary. Each new life deepened the web of lies, binding her tighter to the secret she had been forced to carry. The truth became something dangerous, something that could destroy what little stability she had left. Over time, the lies did more than protect the abuser, they erased her sense of reality. She began to question her own memories, to wonder if maybe this was all her fault after all. In a world built on deception, the truth had nowhere to live, and the pregnancies became just another part of the silence that ruled her life. The children entered the world quietly, as if even at birth they understood they were not meant to be seen. There were no hospital visits, no official records, no announcements made to mark their arrival. Each birth happened within the same walls that had swallowed so many secrets, guided by fear rather than care. From the beginning, their existence was treated as something that needed to be hidden, not protected. They were living proof of a truth that could never be spoken, and so they were raised in the shadows of that truth. As they grew, they learned the rules without being taught. They were told not to speak to strangers, not to wander, not to ask questions about where they came from. Their names were rarely used outside the home, their ages guessed at rather than known. There were no school enrollments, no doctor's visits unless absolutely unavoidable. Illnesses were handled with home remedies and prayer, not because it was tradition, but because exposure carried risk. The children sensed early on that they were different, though they couldn't explain why. They saw other families from a distance, heard stories of classrooms, playgrounds, and friends, things that felt imaginary to them. Their world was small, tightly controlled, and filled with unspoken tension. They learned to read the moods of the adults around them, to stay quiet when voices dropped, to disappear when the air felt heavy. Their mother tried to protect them in the only ways she knew how, offering comfort in whispers, affection when no one was watching. But her fear shaped them as much as her love. She warned them never to speak about their family to anyone, never to say too much, never to trust outsiders. The same lessons that had trapped her were passed down, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. They were never told the truth about who they were or where they came from. The absence of answers became normal, a hollow space inside them that they didn't know how to fill. Questions formed but stayed unspoken, because curiosity in that house had consequences. Identity was something vague and fragile, built on silence rather than understanding. Growing up unseen left marks that couldn't be hidden. Some of the children struggled to speak clearly, others lagged behind in ways no one could explain away forever. Still, they remained concealed, their lives unfolding in isolation, shaped by secrets they didn't create but were forced to carry. They were born into a story already written, one that denied them a voice, a place, and even the simple acknowledgement that they existed at all. In a small mountain town, rumors didn't travel loudly, they drifted like smoke, faint and easy to ignore. People noticed things they couldn't quite explain, a girl who never seemed to age past a certain point, children who appeared suddenly and were rarely seen again, a household that kept its distance even by local standards. These details sparked quiet conversations, exchanged in low voices at church steps or grocery counters, but they were always followed by the same uneasy pause. No one wanted to be the one to say too much. The mountains had taught people to distrust talk. Gossip was considered a kind of sin, and accusing someone without proof was worse than staying silent. When questions arose, they were quickly softened into excuses. The father was private, they said. Old-fashioned. Protective. The girl was troubled, maybe slow, maybe ashamed. The children were sickly, kept indoors for their own good. Each explanation was thin, but together they formed a shield strong enough to protect everyone from responsibility. There was also fear, though few would admit it. Challenging a man's authority over his family felt dangerous, especially when that man was known, respected, and seemingly devout. Calling attention to something dark meant risking conflict, being labeled a troublemaker, or worse, being wrong. In a place where reputation was everything and support was scarce, silence felt safer than confrontation. So the whispers stayed whispers. They never reached the ears of anyone who could act, never grew loud enough to demand answers. Even when contradictions piled up, they were dismissed as misunderstandings. Time passed, seasons changed, and the oddities became familiar enough to fade into the background. What once felt unsettling slowly became normal, absorbed into the rhythm of everyday life. Some people sensed that something was deeply wrong, but sensing wasn't enough. Acting required certainty, and certainty required courage. It was easier to believe that things weren't as bad as they seemed, that whatever was happening behind those walls was not their concern. Distance made denial possible, and denial made life simpler. In the end, the town's greatest protection wasn't the mountains or the isolation, but its collective decision to look away. By refusing to listen closely to the whispers, by treating discomfort as inconvenience rather than warning, the community became part of the silence that allowed the secret to survive, tucked away in the hollow where no one truly wanted to see what had been there all along. The outsider arrived quietly, unaware that the hollow she had wandered into held secrets deeper than the forest itself. She was not from the mountains, not shaped by the same fears and customs that had kept the local families locked in their routines for generations. She noticed details others dismissed, patterns that seemed impossible to ignore. Babies without fathers, a girl who never appeared in school records, a home that seemed too silent for the number of children it contained, all of it whispered inconsistencies that pricked at her sense of reason. She asked questions carefully, masking suspicion with polite curiosity. The neighbors offered answers, but their explanations were thin, rehearsed, and uncomfortable. She noticed how eyes shifted, how sentences trailed off, how some people seemed relieved when she changed the subject. There was a rhythm to the avoidance, a language of denial that everyone spoke without acknowledging it. Unlike the locals, she could not pretend. Her instincts told her something was wrong, and she could not let it go. Inside the house, she observed behaviors that did not match the stories told outside. The girl flinched at certain touches, the children moved with an unnatural caution, and the father's authority had a rigidity that bordered on intimidation. Small details, the way doors clicked, the way voices dropped, the way the family avoided eye contact with her, accumulated in her mind until a picture began to form. It was subtle, layered, and horrifying, but she could not ignore it. The outsider tried to gather information discreetly. She visited the local stores, spoke to distant relatives, and watched the interactions of the household from afar. Each observation added weight to her suspicion, though she lacked the evidence to confront anyone directly. She had to move carefully. One wrong word could raise alarm, and in the mountains, discretion could mean the difference between being heard and being silenced. Even as she pieced together the patterns, she felt the isolation pressing in. The locals were bound by tradition, fear, and unspoken rules, unwilling to see what was right in front of them. Their silence was more than indifference, it was complicity. Yet, she persisted, driven by a combination of moral certainty and unease she could not shake. Her presence began to unsettle the household, though they did not know why. Her questions, her looks, her very observation were threats to the carefully maintained order. It was only a matter of time before the tension escalated, before the hidden truths that had lain dormant for years would be forced into daylight. She became the catalyst, the single spark that might ignite a reckoning in a place that had long refused to confront its darkness. The breaking point arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, trembling confession that had been building for years. The daughter, carrying the weight of secrets that had shaped her entire life, finally found a moment of clarity amidst fear and confusion. The words that emerged were halting at first, whispered in shadows, but each one carried the unbearable truth she had been forced to hold inside. Speaking them was like stepping off a cliff, a mixture of terror and release, a step into a world she had been taught to fear. 4 years, she had lived under rules so strict and constant that obedience became instinct. Silence had been her shield, fear her constant companion. Each pregnancy, each unexplained child, had been buried beneath layers of lies, carefully rehearsed for neighbors, for friends, for anyone who might ask. The weight of the deception pressed on her until it became part of her very being, shaping how she moved, spoke, and thought. To break that silence was unthinkable, and yet the act itself offered a strange kind of freedom, a first taste of truth. The confession came not as a single outburst, but as a slow unraveling. She began with hints, fragments of memories, small cracks in the house of lies. Each revelation felt dangerous, as though saying it aloud could shatter not only her world but the fragile sense of reality she had clung to. The fear of disbelief or retaliation lingered with every word. Still, the truth had grown too heavy to remain buried, and finally, she could no longer bear the weight of carrying it alone. Those around her reacted in ways she had feared and in ways she had hoped for. Shock and confusion rippled through the household, breaking the rhythm of control that had ruled for so long. Some tried to deny it, to argue, to silence her once more, but the courage behind her voice made it impossible to ignore. The walls that had held secrets for generations trembled as the reality they contained began to surface. For the first time, the hidden lives of the children, the manipulation, the abuse, all were laid bare, undeniable and raw. Her breaking of silence became a catalyst, shifting the balance of power that had dominated her life. Where obedience had once ruled, uncertainty and confrontation now moved. Questions that had never been asked could no longer be avoided. The truth, long suppressed, began its slow, painful emergence into the world outside the house. In speaking, she did more than reveal what had happened. She forced everyone around her to confront the magnitude of a horror they had ignored, overlooked, or rationalized, and in doing so, she began the process of reclaiming a life that had been stolen piece by piece. When the truth finally emerged, it did not stay confined to whispers or fearful glances. It demanded action, and that action came in the form of authorities who had once seemed distant and irrelevant. The revelation of years of abuse, secrecy, and manipulation sparked an investigation that would expose layers of horror no one had dared to imagine. Each officer, social worker, and investigator who stepped into the hollow was met with the echoes of a life shaped by fear, and the walls themselves seemed to carry the weight of the generations that had suffered in silence. Evidence was hard to uncover at first: no birth certificates, no medical records, no clear documentation to guide them, but the patterns were unmistakable. Every detail the daughter had revealed, every oddity noticed by neighbors over the years, began to form a horrifying mosaic that confirmed suspicions far worse than anyone had imagined. The children were found living in conditions that were both physically and emotionally restrictive, their development stunted not by neglect in the conventional sense, but by the pervasive manipulation and secrecy that had defined their existence. Authorities quickly realized that the father's control had extended beyond fear. It had created an entire ecosystem in which truth could not exist. Every lie had been reinforced by isolation, every punishment by silence, and every hidden birth by the community's willingness to look away. Investigators were forced to navigate a delicate line between uncovering evidence and protecting the fragile lives of those who had suffered the most. Each question, each examination, peeled back layers of trauma that had been carefully buried, revealing the full scope of the abuse that had spanned decades. The process was slow, painstaking, and deeply unsettling. Officials had to confront not only the immediate crimes but also the systemic failures that had allowed them to continue for so long. Neighbors, once complacent or afraid to speak, were compelled to recount what they had seen, what they had suspected, and what they had ignored. Their testimonies painted a picture of a community that had turned a blind eye, whether out of fear, denial, or misguided loyalty. The father's authority, once unquestioned, crumbled under scrutiny, revealing the depth of manipulation and the psychological grip he had maintained over his family. As the investigation progressed, the hidden horrors became undeniable. Each discovery, from unregistered children to corroborated accounts of abuse, confirmed the scale of the tragedy. The authorities were not merely responding to a single crime, they were untangling a web that had ensnared multiple generations, a deliberate attempt to erase evidence and manipulate perception. The community, too, faced a reckoning, forced to acknowledge that the evil had existed not in isolation, but in plain sight, tolerated by the silence and fear that had long governed the Hollow. The case, shocking in its scope, became a grim testament to what happens when secrecy, authority, and isolation combine unchecked, and how long it can take before hidden truths are finally brought into the light. When the full extent of the horror became known, the mountain town could no longer hide behind its traditions or its silence. The revelations forced a confrontation with truths that had been ignored for decades, truths that now demanded acknowledgement, accountability, and reckoning. The family at the center of the tragedy had lived in isolation, shielded by both fear and respect, and the community had unwittingly become complicit simply by choosing not to see. The townspeople had murmured about oddities, whispered about discrepancies, and dismissed rumors as gossip, but the moment the authorities confirmed the daughter's story, all of those quiet suspicions transformed into undeniable evidence of a long-running nightmare. Shock rippled through the town like a sudden storm. Neighbors who had nodded politely at the family at church now realized that beneath the surface of ordinary life had existed an unthinkable cruelty. Friends and extended family members were forced to grapple with their own inaction, their own choices to turn away from uncomfortable questions. The realization that evil had been living so close, hidden behind familiar faces and daily routines, made the familiar landscape of hills and hollows feel alien and threatening. The mountains, once a symbol of protection and seclusion, now seemed complicit in harboring generations of secrecy, their shadows stretching over both victims and bystanders alike. The victims themselves, the children and the daughter who had broken her silence, faced a complicated mixture of relief and terror. Relief because the truth was finally out, because help had arrived, and because the pattern of abuse could no longer continue unchecked. Terror because the exposure of such private horrors left them vulnerable in new ways, thrust into a world they had been taught to fear and navigate cautiously. For them, the process of healing was only beginning, complicated by years of manipulation, isolation, and secrecy. The community's reckoning was inseparable from their own journey toward understanding who they were outside the confines of that household. Legal and social consequences began to take shape swiftly, but they were only part of the story. The town itself had to confront the cultural and psychological conditions that allowed such a tragedy to persist. Questions of morality, responsibility, and communal oversight were unavoidable, and the answers were neither simple nor comfortable. People were forced to examine the ways isolation, unquestioned authority, and fear can intertwine to create a space where abuse thrives unnoticed. The story of the family became a mirror reflecting the town's own failures, its complicity, and the human tendency to ignore what is difficult to face. Ultimately, the revelation was more than the exposure of one household's crimes, it was a reckoning for an entire community. The dark truths of the Hollow had been brought into the light, forcing both victims and neighbors to confront the depth of human cruelty and the heavy cost of silence, and compelling a society to reckon with the uncomfortable reality that evil can exist in familiar places, often unnoticed until it is too late to ignore.